If you have been watching it, a highly recommended TV show, Masters of the Air. It explores the experiences of American bomber pilots flying in the 8th Air Force during World War II. It follows the personal stories of pilots, bombardiers, navigators, and other crew members who flew perilous missions over Nazi-occupied Europe. The final episode is this week, so I thought I would investigate some of the bomber planes that flew during the war. So here are 5 bomber planes which flew during World War II which have fascinating stories. Number 1. Ye Olde Pub. On December 20th, 1943, Lieutenant Charles Brown was flying the B-17 bomber Ye Olde Pub. The target was an aircraft production facility in Bremen. The mission was very dangerous, and the bomber plane faced heavy flak attack and relentless attack from the German Luftwaffe. Ye Olde Pub suffered severe damage, losing its nose and engine with 2 other engines damaged, leaving with only 40% power. Struggling to maintain speed, the bomber plane fell well behind the rest of the other bomber group, leaving it isolated and vulnerable to attack. It was targeted by a dozen fighter planes and sustained even more damage, including to the hydraulics, electrical system and oxygen. 1 crew member was dead and others were badly injured. Ye Olde Pub survived the relentless attacks, but a German fighter pilot by the name of Franz Stigler flying in Messerschmitt Bf 109 caught up to the stricken plane, but seeing the damage and the injured crew members inside, he refused to fire upon it. Stigler instead flew in close formation with the bomber, preventing ground troops from flying their flak cannons. Stigler tried to signal to Brown that he should surrender, but Brown refused. Stigler then suggested they escort the plane to neutral Sweden, but Brown didn't understand his intentions, so kept flying. Eventually they made it to the perimeter of German airspace. Stigler saluted and flew away. Brown was told by his superiors to never mention the incident, lest other damaged bombers refuse to fire on approaching fighter planes in the hopes they would encounter similar compassion. And of course Stigler never mentioned the fact he just let a bomber escape. It wasn't until years later, when Brown wanted to connect with the pilot who spared his life, that the story came to light. In the 1990s, Brown tracked down Stigler, who was living in Canada. The 2 men, once enemies in wartime skies, became close friends, bonding over a shared experience and mutual respect. Their friendship endured until both passed away in 2008, just months apart, leaving behind a legacy of compassion and humanity. Number 2. The Ghost Plane. In the autumn of 1944, at a British airbase near Brussels, anti-aircraft gunners spotted an approaching B-17 Flying Fortress. Its landing gear was down, but it was approaching at very high speed, and because of this speed, it impacted hard, with one of the wingtips hitting the ground, shattering one of the propellers. As the dust settled, the plane came to a halt a mere 100 feet from the astonished soldiers. Expecting the crew to emerge, everybody waited, but nobody came out. Major John Crisp entered the plane, expecting to find injured or dead crew members, but it was empty. The aircraft's tail number revealed it belonged to the US 91st Bomber Group based out of eastern England. This aircraft had been part of a daylight mission against oil installations in eastern Germany. The crew was eventually found in Brussels, Belgium, and it was confirmed that they had bailed out from the aircraft. According to the crew, they were preparing for their bombing run when their plane was struck by anti-aircraft fire. The resulting explosion inflicted significant damage to the bomber rack, making it incapable of releasing their payload. Furthermore, one of the 4 engines was completely disabled. In response, they altered the course of the B-17 and headed back to England. But the plane continued to descend, so they turned on the autopilot and bailed. Of course, the big mystery here is how the plane landed itself with no crew on board. But there were other mysteries. Major John Crisp reported there was no flak damage and all parachutes were on board the plane. The men manning the aircraft gun said all 4 engines were running before the plane landed. This contradicts the testimony of the crew. Unfortunately, no thorough investigation was launched. So the mystery of the contradicting statements and how the plane landed itself was never solved. Number 3. Hot stuff. When bomber crews signed on, they were committed to flying 25 combat bombing missions before they could return home. One of the first and most famous of these was the crew of the Memphis Belle. Upon completion of the 25 missions, they went back to the USA and embarked on a public relations and bond tour. Subsequently, there has been a documentary and a box office movie made about the Memphis Belle, but it actually wasn't the first plane to complete its 25 mission tour in European theatre. That honour went to the crew of the Hot Stuff, who completed the 25 mission task 3 months before the Memphis Belle. Hot Stuff flew 31 missions before it was selected to fly home to undergo a publicity and bond tour. Lieutenant General Frank Andrews, also known as the father of the US Air Force, was recalled to the USA, so he decided to hitch a ride upon Hot Stuff. Unfortunately, Hot Stuff's luck had run out and had crashed in bad weather in Iceland, killing 13 of the 14 crew members aboard, including Andrews. Little did Andrews know, but he was actually being recalled to the USA because he was being made Supreme Allied Commander of the European Theatre. But due to this cruel twist of fate, that honour went to Eisenhower, and the Memphis Belle became the most famous plane to complete 25 missions, with hot stuff and a courageous crew largely forgotten. Number 4. Flackbait. When crews completed their 25 mission tour, they got to go home, but of course their planes continued flying combat missions with new crews. Flackbait, a B-26 Marauder, completed an incredible 200 combat missions, the most of any American bomber. When naming the plane Flackbait, Lieutenant James Farrell, its first assigned pilot, could not have known just how apt that name was going to be. By the end of his 200 combat missions, Flackbait had accumulated over 1,000 holes through flak and gunfire. But despite over 700 hours worth of combat missions and the extensive damage it required, no crew member of Flackbait ever died. In fact, only one crew member was ever injured. As an interesting tidbit, Major John Egan of Masters of the Air was the last pilot to ever fly Flackbait. It wasn't a combat mission, but it was merely to fly Flackbait to Bavaria so it could be disassembled and flown back to the USA. Because of its incredible combat record, Flackbait was donated to the Smithsonian, where it is currently undergoing extensive restoration. Number 5. The Swoos. Old Betsy was a B-17D variant that was stationed in the Philippines when the war broke out. Immediately upon the onset of hostilities, she began flying combat missions. When the Japanese invaded the Philippines, Old Betsy was moved to Java, where it continued flying combat missions. The plane received significant damage while flying combat missions off the coast of Borneo and had to return to Australia to receive extensive repairs. Its engines were replaced, it received a new tail from another D variant, and it was converted into an armed transport plane. The plane just got a new nickname, the Swoos, half swan, half goose, as the plane was made up of different parts from different airplanes. Although no longer flying bombing missions, the plane did get involved in combat when flying to advanced air bases and combat zones. The switch from a transport plane to a bomber plane was a blessing to the Swoos. It became the only B-17 to be in active service from the start of the war until the end of the war. It was also the only B-17 variant to survive the war, with its distinctive shark fin tail. The plane's pilot, Captain Frank Kurtz, was much enamored by the plane, even named his daughter after it, Swoosie Kurtz, an Emmy Award and Tony Award winning actress. Kurtz also came to the plane's rescue when after the war it was slated to be melted down. It now resides at the National Museum of the US Air Force and is undergoing restoration, which is expected to be completed in 2030. I hope you enjoyed these fascinating stories. I have another video in the pipeline that explores some of the untold stories of the 100 Bomber Group, the focus of the TV show Masters of the Air. So please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on that video.